Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everyone from around the world to the Institute of Coaching's February public webinar. My name is Jeff Hull, as Sue indicated, and I am the Director of Education with the Institute of Coaching. And I am super excited to be here with you today and our presenter, Dr. Paul Zak, who will spend the next hour with us together talking about the neuroscience of connection. I am particularly excited to get an opportunity to spend time with Paul. I was just sharing with him that in my last book, I did a whole section on the trust factor of organizations and referenced his work and did a lot of digging into his wonderful neuroscience studies. And unfortunately, a big chunk of it ended up on the cutting room floor from my editor. So it gave me the opportunity to learn more about him and his amazing studies that he's done. And I'm so thrilled that he's with us here today. So before we get started, just a couple of little logistics to add to what Sue shared. We definitely want your questions, so please put questions in the Q&A box throughout our session. We're going to try to get to them in a couple of different chunks, and we will record this program, and it will be available on our website within a couple of days, and we will keep all the Q&A. So in case we didn't get to your question, we can also follow up and share it with Paul. Let me give you a little bit about his background. Paul is the founding director of the Center for Neuroeconomic Studies and a professor of economics, psychology, and management at Claremont Graduate University. His new book is called The Trust Factor: The Science of Creating High-Performance Companies. And he specializes in using neuroscience to measure and manage organizational culture and to inspire teamwork and accelerate business outcomes. He's really a specialist in the study of how to create trust within organizations. And he was really one of the first to discover the power of the neurochemical oxytocin and how that impacts relationships, trust, love, and morality within organizations. So I'm sure he's going to dig into his research about that for us as coaches. I am really excited to have you here, Paul, and I want to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. What a nice introduction, and really pleasure to be with you all. So we're going to have lots of time for questions, and I want to kind of go through and talk today about what I've tried to do for the last 25 years, which is understand humans. So you've met the humans. They're a very interesting species. What's interesting about humans, or one of the things that's interesting about humans, is that they produce language. From a scientific perspective, what I find fascinating about language is that people say one thing, but do another thing. And in addition, if you ask them why they did such a thing, they will give you all kinds of interesting answers, often unrelated to what appears to be their true motivations. So this, as Jeff suggested, really led me into trying to understand humans from a neuroscience perspective. Could we identify neurologic factors, signals from the brain that would tell us why people are doing what they're doing, and then reverse engineer that process and create situations in which we can help them reach their goals by knowing what is either inhibiting them from doing something that would be better for them or for their organizations, or identify really their true motivations. And I think that's where coaching comes in. Big fan of coaching. I think everyone probably needs it at some point. And I really want to focus this on what I think are the kind of core parts of coaching, as I understand it at least, which is forming connection with your client and then persuading him or her towards a different set of behaviors. And those are both difficult topics. It turns out that they are related from a neuroscience perspective. So that allows us to have a framework to capture that. And then Immersion is my software company, which we started 3 years ago, that allows us to actually measure this. So at the end of my talk, I'm going to actually show you some data that I'm collecting on myself live. So we'll see how effectively I am connecting and persuading you all who are here. So that's our plan. So one question is, how do you know if you're being effective as a coach? And to do that, you can look at outcomes for sure. But the other result that I've seen when I've done sort of culture interventions at organizations is stickiness. So often when the coach is there prodding you, the client will do, what you've persuaded them is in their best interest. Again, as Jeff suggested, I'm not going to be able to persuade you unless I can create the conditions in which you feel comfortable with me, you feel like I'm trustworthy, I've connected to you, and vice versa. So we'll have to talk a little about that as well. But it'd be really nice to know if the techniques I use, the language I use with that client were effective specifically for that specific client. And so you guys are obviously pivoting, right, as you figure out how to help this client get better at say, leading an organization. But at the same time, you're depending on your intuition. And so intuition is fallible. And then we're back to this difficult human problem. I don't know a ton about humans, but when I started doing neuroscience studies 25 years ago, I know, like, drilling into your skull and putting electrodes in your brain, most humans are not really cool with that. So we need some other measurement technology. So let me tell you about the science of connection and persuasion, and then we'll go through and talk about applications. So what we've really worked on in the last 20 years or so is to identify signals in the brain that in combination identify if information is effectively getting into the head and if it will stick. So stick means it subsequently produces a behavior that I can measure. So when we started doing this work, we worked backwards, right? We ran studies, many, many laboratory studies and field studies in which we measured brain activity, gave people a stimulus, and then just tracked whether they responded to that stimulus or not. And then initially started by measuring changes in neurochemicals. So Jeff mentioned oxytocin, kind of very well known for kind of showing one of the first people to show the behavioral effects of that. And indeed, that was because I developed a protocol that allowed, without drilling into the skull, scientists to measure the human brain's acute production of oxytocin. So once we have tools, then we can ask a lot of interesting questions. And so through running many, many, many studies, from blood draws to drug infusion studies to studies measuring hundreds of signals from the brain simultaneously, we were able to sort of winnow down to those sets of signals that consistently predicted what people would do and what they would remember. So started this company, Immersion Neuroscience. We call this distributed neuroscience. I'll tell you how that works. The value of this and why I'm talking about today is that it allows us to get out of the laboratory and enable anybody with the software platform to measure how effectively individuals are connecting and persuading those around them. So now there's a real tool that's available to the general public. And those field studies, I think, are very compelling, because now we can actually talk about not just works in this sterile laboratory setting, but what works really in practice. And so because we've got thousands of people using this platform, once I go through the science, I really want to spend some time on things you can do immediately in your practice from what our clients have found. So we're going to identify best practice by having this distributed neuroscience platform. So that is where we are going. Okay. One of the things we've also found is that in this sort of training coaching space is that by identifying when the brain is saturated with information, you can identify those who have kind of nailed this, they're ready to go, they can move forward, and those who need additional coaching. So as I said earlier, it allows you to really begin to customize, whether it's one-on-one or one-on-many, your ability to connect to individuals. So the one-on-many is oftentimes a harder problem because you have diversity in understanding how effectively the information got into people's heads and affected their behavior. So having a tool to help give you objective information on the effectiveness of your coaching is, I think, really been a game changer. Whoops, sorry about that. And then lastly, we have this other problem, which is we're all at home, or most of us probably at home. And so we have distractions. I do think it's wonderfully humanizing when someone's little kid comes in the screen or the dog barks or whatever it is. So that's fine. We don't have to have a work Paul and a home Paul. It's just Paul, right? It's just me. So I think it's very humanizing. I'm wearing a casual shirt and, I'm in my back room. So I do think actually it's a nice thing to have that human connection. But it also means that people are more distracted. So again, there may be two screens going, right? So I could be looking down and be looking at my phone, or who knows what's going on. So again, having this sort of extra piece of technology to assess whether this information is effectively being communicated, I think is really interesting. So again, just to emphasize this is I'm going to base this talk on a bunch of client work. A lot of those are in the training and education space, and I'm going to try to specialize that into coaching. And so you're going to give me feedback in the question and answer period on whether I've done that effectively. So a little overview of the science. So oxytocin is this chemical made in your brain that is released when we have positive social interactions. So I greet Jeff in the hallway, or give him a hug, or say something nice to him, open the door for him. We exercise together, or go for a jog. All that's going to release oxytocin, and it has an interesting set of behavioral effects. One is it reduces physiologic stress, right? So if I'm around other humans, I'm always balancing the motivation to connect with that person, talk to that person, see if we can form some kind of collaboration. That's the oxytocin side, and the appropriate distrust, if you will, or vigilance that this person might be weird, might be dangerous, might seem odd. And so this balancing factor, so that kind of fear response is very well studied. But to 20 years ago, when we started measuring oxytocin in the brain on humans, we found that understanding why we want to, or motivated to socialize with others, interact with others, really wasn't well understood. And oxytocin is part of a larger brain network that does that. I think what's interesting about this is also oxytocin increases our sense of empathy. So now from a connection perspective, I've got to have that client connect with me. I've got to show that I am safe to be around, that I am trustworthy. Certainly you have to be qualified and know what you're doing, but at the same time, you've got to have that warmth so this person feels like there's a connection, right? You've got to want them to absorb the information. And there's some important precursors we found for that we'll talk about in a minute. So I've got to make that connection. Once I've got that connection, we've also shown that oxytocin motivates individuals to work for group goals. And so if I can connect effectively to my client and I get his or her brain to release oxytocin, now I've increased empathy and I've set the stage neurologically so that these things we want to work on together are more likely to be met. So humans are really built to work in groups. It's not unnatural for us. We have many more receptors for oxytocin in the brain than any other mammals. And in addition, we get a kind of a reward response, dopamine response from cooperation. It feels good to cooperate. So even if you have cranky clients, if you can break through and make that connection, then you can, in some sense, hack their brains so that you help them move to where they want to go. And that's a hard problem. And it's a hard problem from a neuroscience perspective, because the brain takes so much energy to run that it tries to modulate that high overhead by establishing habits. So these are default pathways in the brain. So for a set of environmental stimuli, I'm going to do the same thing over and over. And so part of your job as coaches is to break that habit, that old habit, whether it's yelling at your direct reports or, I don't know, slamming doors or whatever those things are that, we need to work on. The way I've been doing this for 35, 45, 55 years is really well established in my brain. And it requires metabolic energy to change those default pathways. And again, that's where the coaching, the encouragement, the practice of this, and the feedback are very important. So as we started doing this work, we received funding from DARPA and a bunch of other government agencies that also were interested in predicting what humans would do after they had an experience. And we had millions of dollars from the US taxpayers, so we're very grateful to essentially measure every brain signal known to humans simultaneously. So we measured hundreds of signals and asked, are there sets of those signals that in combination would consistently predict what people would do after an experience? And not only did we take the signals that these neuroscience devices pushed out, but we also combined them in ways that allows us to maximize prediction. So we didn't just say take an EEG signal or a signal from the sweat in the palms, but we actually combine these in unexpected ways. So I said we did unnatural things to natural data. So that was a way to really understand whether we could effectively connect to others, and when we connect, potentially persuade them. Okay. So just tons of work, millions of dollars. And by the way, lots of mistakes. We went to a bunch of cul-de-sacs and made mistakes that allowed us to simultaneously measure brain from the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system simultaneously, and use drug studies to turn on the pathways between them so that we could identify consistent signals. And the signals are essentially the signals from the cranial nerves. So the signals at the level of the brain, most neurons in the brain are doing multiple things. Right now, most of what your brain is doing is keeping you alive and conscious. And so I don't care about that. I'd like to pick up whether the underlying information I'm giving to you and how I'm presenting it is effectively getting into your brain. So I need to extract out all that background noise of survival and identify these ribbons of information consistently that tell us how your brain is valuing this experience. And that value is both attentional, but also emotional. I've got to get you to care about what I'm talking about. And again, if you think about that from the coaching side, getting you to care about this is metabolically costly. I'm asking that organism to expend metabolic energy so that this new information can actually not only get in, but stick in, right? This is the difference between hearing and listening, right? There's a big gulf between those. And the listening part really requires active participation from your client. And to do that, you've got to form this connection. So what we've discovered, and we call this neurologic state immersion, is a situation where I'm attentional. I'm paying attention to the thing I'm doing. So that comes from the brain's prefrontal cortex. But importantly, I actually care about it. It's emotionally resonant, right? I've got this valuation in my brain. And that emotional resonance is largely driven by oxytocin. So when I have this combined state, which is kind of unusual neurologically, in which I'm attentive and I really care about it, then my brain tags this information as important. So if you think about information you're going to try to put into a client's head, so in your head is it's all goopy inside your brain, so it's slippery. So it's a little soccer ball I'm going to put in your head with new information. And if I don't have that tagging as the emotional tagging as important, it's hard for me to grip out the soccer ball, hard for that client to pull out the information. But if I put these emotional tags on it and I convince the client that this is very important, then it's like a little grippy handles on that soccer ball. I can just pull that soccer ball out whenever I need it. And so that's why we remember these really emotional events in our lives, like birth of a child or 9/11 or anything kind of extraordinary that happens in your life, wedding, easy to remember because it has all those emotional tags. And so that's one way that we can, once we connect to others, persuade them. We put these emotional tags in so the information is more easily recalled. And in fact, it's saved, emotional information is saved in the brain in a very specific way that makes it more easily accessed. Okay, so lots of applications for this. I want to talk about just a couple here. So we've created this dashboard for individuals to measure how effectively they are able to connect and persuade. And I think one of the great applications we're seeing clients use is to enhance employee performance. And again, that requires that the client, the employee, be fully engaged in this task. And so I mentioned there's a precursor before I get to the connection part, and that precursor is what we call psychological safety. Most of you have heard of this. It became quite famous because of Google's work. Their Project Aristotle showed that psychological safety, using a short survey, was the strongest predictor of high performance teams. So what we did is we created a physiologic measure of psychological safety. We can pull all these data from a smartwatch, and we can establish in as short as 3 minutes whether that meeting, one-on-one, one-on-many, whether the attendees are actually psychologically safe. If they're not, got to make a change, got to pivot. let's do a 3-minute eyes closed meditation. Let's do a bio break. Let's establish the foundation for an effective communication. So psychological safety first, then connection, then persuasion. Once we have that, then we can really talk about using neurologic signals to help people job craft. So identifying, what do you love doing? What's the best part of your job? Or what would you like to be doing more of? So it's one of those things you all know, part of human nature. If I enjoy doing it, I'm just going to do it more and better. So if we're really thinking about how to motivate people to put in discretionary effort, it's really finding what their core strengths are, and lots of ways to find those strengths. But one of those is to do the tasks and actually see if your brain is, quote, turned on. Is it really immersed in this task? Do they love it? If not, then maybe more training, more coaching is needed. So the old world was, your boss said, hey, we're short some people in accounting, and hey, Bob, you got to do some more accounting the next 2 weeks. And you're like, well, okay, it's not my favorite thing to do, but I guess I got to do it. Where in this new world, it's really empowering employees to begin to manage their own careers, where they would know and they can share with their supervisors, hey, look, I've been measuring myself at work for the past 3 months, and I really love working with clients. I really love leading teams, and I can do accounting, but it's not really something that I get immersed in. It's not something that my brain values. And so, I'd rather do more of the stuff that turns me on. I'm just going to do it better. So I think that's really great. What we find is that highly immersive experiences are also enjoyable. So again, just to be clear, what I said earlier, when we identified this neurologic state immersion, we went backwards. We looked at people's brain activity who responded in a positive way, an objectively observable way to an experience, compared to those who didn't. Just winnowed these down. So we are not capturing feelings. Feelings are too vague and fleeting. I don't want to anchor anything I'm doing on having to put you in a certain feeling state or mood state. Rather, we want to identify the neurologic factors that will predict what people will actually do. And those neurologic factors are enjoyment. So we have some clients in the entertainment space, and they use our technology to do everything from create movie trailers to evaluate scripts, edit movies and TV shows. And so one of the most powerful things we'll talk about is actually the way you present information has a big impact on how effectively it's absorbed. So that's structure. So how I structure information. And that's essentially what entertainers do, or entertainment production companies. They try to structure information not only so that it is tells a cohesive narrative, but in fact that it's enjoyable. And so it's nice that these things work together. We have a bunch of clients in the learning and training space. One of those that's talked a lot about it is Accenture. So Accenture is a big professional services organization, produces $1 billion of training annually for their employees. So they call this future-proofing their employees. And they have an amazing team of learning architects who begin to look at content and look at training and optimize delivery. And they never had a really good way, other than the post-training survey, which is not very valuable, to assess whether their content and delivery is getting better, getting worse, is it really sticking in people's heads? So for the past, 2.5 years, they've been using our technology to actually measure the impact of training. And we're going to get an immediate takeaway from them in 5 minutes. So one of the core things they found, particularly for remote training, which we're primarily doing now. One of the things that Accenture's done is to look at immersion leaders. So who just digs this information more than anybody? So these people kind of top of the immersion list. This again is Neurologic. It's not like I like Bob, my favorite trainee. I don't know, because he smiles a lot. It's that neurologically I can see that Bob really absorbed this material. And so Accenture will then identify those individuals in a room and say, look, Bob, why don't you lead the discussion with your peers? Debrief, tell us what you've done, which I think is very interesting. So it really allows for customization. And that's really in the one-to-many case, but it certainly can work on one-for-one as well. And then we have clients who are using this to measure and manage meetings, particularly when meetings all went remote. mean, it's hard enough when you're a room full of people to really understand if you're making an impact. You can kind of get it. For me, the signal when I'm talking live is this. If I hear a lot of shuffling of papers and, people moving their feet, probably need to slow down or stop or change approaches, right? People are getting fidgety. But remotely, super hard. I mean, it's really tough because it's just a 2D, set of information. And so by measuring meetings, again, this is the one-to-many approach, then you begin to curate that meeting for high immersion, increasing recall, increasing productivity, and in particular, ensuring that the most important information happens at immersion peaks. So you guys may have heard of this kind of key finding from psychology called the peak end rule. So we tend to remember the peak emotional parts of experiences and the ends of experiences. And so when that peak happens, when that most important information happens, I'd like to have an immersion peak. And I'm gonna give you some ways you can do that in just a couple minutes. And so really knowing how the sort of ebbs and flows of meetings happen allow you to be much more effective and then manage those meetings for higher impact. So this is how it works. You add immersion to a coaching session. It is automated. This happens via at a link to an email invite for your Zoom session or video conferencing session. Attendees show up virtually or in person. No surreptitious data collection. So if you have a supported smartwatch, the data is being collected. So my watch is collecting data right now on me, and we'll see if I'm any good or not, as I said. And then you do your coaching. Again, one-to-one, one-to-many. As soon as that's over, the platform produces a report for the coach or the trainer that gives you stats, to gives you some data that shows you how effective that session was. And then we've actually created this platform to work in real time so that you can actually check in real time, particularly for psychological safety, and make sure that people are actually having the bandwidth to absorb the information you're giving them. So think of psychological safety as kind of the opposite of anxiety. So if you're super anxious, you're just kind of hanging on with your fingernails, you're trying to get through the next 10 minutes of life. You don't have a lot of bandwidth to absorb new information, to connect to a coach, to make new plans, to do something different. You just don't have that kind of energy. And so by establishing psychological safety first and monitoring that during training sessions, you can actually be more effective as a coach. And then lastly, one of the things that Accenture has told us is by knowing that immersion correlates with key performance indicators, then I can actually track those over time. I can show, or they've been able to show, that they're increasing the immersion of their training sessions. So they're managing these metrics to show they're producing a return on investment for their organization. So there's a bunch of metrics there that allow them to ensure that the training they provide is effective. Okay, so a couple things, just to kind of summarize, and then we're going to I'll take a breath. So one is I want to see if I'm coaching effectively, right? So that's a question about on average. It's a question about norms. So compared to norms in the platform, am I connecting today on average? Am I increasing that average over time? Am I actually working effectively as a coach? Because oftentimes you're not going to directly see the kind of behaviors you're trying to help this trainee reach. Second, predicting KPIs. So I think for coaching, knowledge retention is a very important one, but also change in behaviors. So how do I capture those? Those behavior changes may be hard to capture. I may have to survey direct reports, other folks, clients, or I can get a kind of a leading indicator that information stuck in your brain is available to that trainee, and it's very likely that those new behaviors are being met. As I said earlier, the platform produces a leaderboard, so you'll know who your immersion champions are, who can be the evangelist and spread the word so that you can leverage the coaching you're doing to an entire organization. And then lastly, find out who's frustrated, who just can't keep up. So that's okay. Again, I think as trainers and coaches, we have to absorb the risk that we are able to connect and persuade others. And if we can't, there's no finger pointing here. It doesn't mean that trainee is not motivated or is not interested. It could be that, I don't know, I have an accent, I know. I have a funny accent, and so you just, I don't know, you're just stuck on that weird accent I have, and you just, it's not effective for you. That's okay, great, get a different coach or give you some different material. I mean, lots of different ways that I can get this information in your head. But if I don't actually know if it's getting in there or not, then I don't know if I should pivot or not. And clearly doing this remotely is just much harder. So one of the things we found, or Accenture has found, is that it's very difficult to remain immersed for more than 20 minutes. And so a lot of companies, including Accenture, are now working in wellness breaks. So I'm going to do a 2-minute wellness break with you guys. I recommend you stand up, do some stretching. You can get a nice glass of water, have a sip of some fluids. So we're going to take a 2-minute wellness break, give you a chance of brain just to settle. I put a lot of information in, and we come back in 2 minutes. We will talk about takeaways, best practice, things you can do immediately with your trainees. Okay, so I've got 3 minutes after the hour. We'll come back at 5 minutes after. So get up, stretch, get some blood moving, and we'll talk to you in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Paul. We'll be back.
So if you don't want to leave your desk, I'm just going to stretch a little bit. I've been sitting all day. If you're on the East Coast, it's later. I'm on the West Coast, so it's still early for me, but I've been up early, so I can still move around. So I'm stretching, getting some blood in my legs. Just nice to stand up.
I was already out shoveling 18 inches of snow this morning, so.
There you go. You don't need more activity.
Actually, I do need to stretch because it's you get the contraction phase, right?
Exactly.
After you've exerted. So I can appreciate that you do need to not contract. You also need to stay flexible.
Absolutely. And we're not built to sit still for hours and hours, right? Our spines don't like that. So, okay. And hydration, also important. So for people who are watching half of my body on the screen. Okay, we got about 1 more minute. Still going to do some stretching. Well, shoveling snow is wonderful exercise. That's a good reason to get out and get warmed up in the morning outside.
I'm glad that I love the positive framing.
Yeah, out in the desert where we haven't seen rain in, I don't know, months. Something beautiful about big snowstorms anyway. Everything's white for a while and quiet.
Yeah, it looks gorgeous.
It does look gorgeous till it gets dirty.
If I could just sit and look at it all day, I'd be,
yeah.
It's blissful.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back in about 15 seconds, folks. So if you are getting a coffee or getting a nice glass of water, we'll return in a few seconds. Thank you for taking a wellness break with me. Hope it was fun. Hope it will refresh our brains. So thank you, Accenture, for finding that nice break is needed. So I certainly feel refreshed. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to drive coaching success, and I'm going to give you some key takeaways. So as I said earlier, this is a summary. If you think about the key piece of information you want that trainee to know, if you can if you curate that training session, that coaching session, so that the most important information occurs at emotional peaks, that's a great way to increase information recall. So I'm going to give you some examples of that in just a second. Certainly you can measure the efficacy of your coaching by looking at increasing immersion, establishing psychological safety, very important. Give you a chance to look in real time, particularly in a one-to-many setting where it's really difficult to kind of read whether that room is staying with you. So that's just a great tool to have. And then finally, the platform gives people smartwatches immediate feedback. As soon as that coaching session is over, he or she will see kind of how effective that session was and they begin to self-manage their own training. So if they have a poor session, then maybe we should accelerate and do the next coaching session instead of 3 weeks later. Maybe we should do it next week, right? So the person begins to understand how effectively they are absorbing their own information, and that self-management is, in some sense, the goal, right? You don't want to coach people for the rest of their lives. You want to coach them, get them going, establish these new habits, and then have them follow through. And so you and they can know when that's been done effectively. So I wrote an article in TD Magazine, which is online for free. I'm going to pull some of the information today from that. You can certainly find that. I'm sure we can put a link in somewhere, easily found, and some additional takeaways from clients. So first is preparation. So really establishing what the goals are. The brain loves anticipation. So by telling you what you're going to do before you do it, you build up this anticipation for that coaching session. This is like, the week before your vacation, you're thinking about Hawaii, you're thinking about how nice and warm it's going to be, about lying on the beach. And so having that agenda is clear. I think it's really important to clarify what the key performance indicators are. What's our goal here? What are we trying to get to? And make sure that we're consistently working on those goals. And then vary the kinds of information that you use for the pre-coaching session. Have them read in advance, have them watch a video, put a little bit of this information in so that when you begin to coach, you're reinforcing what's already there. So it's a really great way to accelerate your ability to connect and persuade. The second is something that really surprised me when we started doing this work years ago, is that a really effective way to get emotional buy-in is to tell a story. Right. So one of the terms of art in the presentation trade now is lead with a story. And that story really means a human scale story. So a story of a person with a struggle, with authentic emotions, to demonstrate why the point you're trying to make is important. You can augment that story with data, with videos, other things, but really starting with that human scale story is such an effective way to both connect and to set up the conditions for persuasion so that they really understand that this is important. Other people have done it. People like you have done this, have made this transition to changing a set of habits. And then during presentations, changing media types. So as I said, 20 minutes is kind of the max that people can stay immersed because it's metabolically costly. And so I can mix that up by changing media style. So when I give a 1 hour talk, I intersperse lots of videos, lots of funny pictures. I'm changing this, and the brain loves the new thing. It loves something that is surprising. And so think about, even if it's an hour coaching session, having some surprises in there. So I'm going to give you an example of what I call a purpose narrative. So why someone's doing something, which is a very powerful way to talk about it. This is Tony Robbins. I'm actually not a huge Tony Robbins fan, but man, does he present well. So it's, I think, a 90-second clip. I'm just going to play this, and then we're just going to diagnose it for a second.
Because the sixth need is to contribute beyond ourselves. Because we all know, corny as it sounds, the secret of living is giving. We all know life's not about me, it's about we. This culture knows that. This room knows that. And it's exciting. When you see Nicholas up here talking about his $100 computer, the most passionate, exciting thing is here's a genius, but he's got a calling now. You can feel the difference in him. And it's beautiful. And that calling can touch other people. In my own life, my life was touched because when I was 11 years old, Thanksgiving, no money, no food, and we're not going to starve, but my father was totally messed up. My mom was letting him know how bad he messed up. And somebody came to the door and delivered food. My father made 3 decisions. I know what they were briefly. His focus was, this is charity. What does it mean? I'm worthless. What do I got to do? Leave my family, which he did. The time, one of the most painful experiences of life. My 3 decisions gave me a different path. I said, focus on, there's food, what a concept. Second, but this is what changed my life. This is what shaped me as a human being. Somebody's gift, I don't even know who it is. I thought, my father always said, no one gives a shit. And all of a sudden, somebody I don't know, they're not asking for this, giving our family food, looking out for us. It made me believe this. What does it mean? That strangers care. And what that made me decide is strangers care about me and my family. I care about them. What am I going to do? I'm going to do something, make a difference. So when I was 17, I went out one day on Thanksgiving. It was my target for years, have enough money to feed 2 families. Most fun thing I ever did in my life, most moving. Then next year I did 4. And I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. Next year, 8. I wasn't doing it for brownie points, but after 8, I thought, shit, I could use some help. So sure enough, I went out, and what did I do? I got my friends involved, and I grew companies, and I got 11 companies, and I built a foundation. Now, 18 years later, I'm proud to tell you, last year we fed 2 million people in 35 countries through our foundation, all during the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and all the different countries around the world. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, again, so whether you like the story or not, or believe the story, it's a well-crafted story, right? It's got a crisis, introduces characters, and then it has a decision point. It's kind of a hero's journey story, but it tells you why Tony Robbins is so passionate about his foundation, and it's very humanizing, right? We can imagine ourselves being abandoned by a parent and having no food, and it's a compelling story. So again, if you can use stories like that, it doesn't have to be from your personal life, could be from another client whose name you obviously wouldn't use, or someone else in history, to tell them how people have, through coaching, understood more about themselves, more about where they want to be, more about being the best person they can, and therefore being a better leader, a better team member. I think it's really powerful. So again, I was not a sort of story guy, but having now measured hundreds and hundreds of stories, that narrative arc is just super effective. And I should say, what's cool about storytelling is there's like an immersion halo after a really good story. So I've really captured you, I've immersed you in this story. And now it's, at least for I don't know, about 30 seconds, I've kind of got you. So now I want to actually use that persuasion technique. So I've captured you, I've connected to you through a story, and now I have a chance to say, okay, let's apply this to our own work. Let's apply this to our own lives. This is what we're going to do with you. We're going to work on doing this thing, right? So it's a real opportunity to kind of use a brain hack to make bigger impact. Sorry. Psychological safety, as I mentioned, very important. There's some ways you can do this even online. One is what I call emotional check-ins. So we do this normally in the hallway when we're in the office together. Hey, Jeff, how are you? Are things going okay? So one way you can do that I found is effective is just instead of saying, hi, how are you? Good, how are you? Use an emotional adjective. So, hi, Jeff, you look happy, sad, worried, joyful, fill in an emotional word. And that opens up the ability of the person you're talking to respond in that way. Oh yeah, I do. I'm really tired. My kid was sick all night, or my dog died last week. I'm really sad, or whatever those are. So now we have a level of connection, right? So that connection is really important. I mentioned wellness breaks. Feeling silly together is a really good way to release oxytocin, form these emotional connections. So any movement that people do together actually will cause the brain to release oxytocin, from singing to dancing to doing exercises. So, and if it's silly, it breaks down those barriers, that normal kind of mask we put on to seem like we're serious people. So get silly. It's actually great. And then really, focus on having trainees manage their own learning. And real simple stuff, please and thank you. It's so important. Again, any of those positive social behaviors are great oxytocin stimuli and motivate those around us to reciprocate in kind. So it sounds like what you heard in kindergarten, but still it really works. From data from Accenture, I mentioned earlier, really look at the value prop for the individual learners. Accenture has what I've called the 20-20-20 rule: no more than 20 minutes of presentation, followed by 20 minutes of practice, followed by 20 minutes of debrief. And so I think it's really important to really kind of think about breaking up the tyranny of the 60-minute clock into smaller chunks. It's really much more important, Accenture tells me, when we're in the remote world. In medicine, they have this saying called see one, do one, teach one. I think it's the same thing. It's a great way to understand and reinforce your learning by telling others around them. If you're doing one-to-many coaching, you can use a round robin method, so everybody has a chance to speak, not just the lovely extroverts who are in the room who want to speak up more than anything in the world. You can do things like gamify coaching using things like badges. And if you do this neurologically, hey, you're an immersion champion, awesome. You're going to be our discussion leader. You're going to carry this information forward to your direct reports. Those badges could be virtual, they could be actual, but a way to sustain that conversation and reinforce the material. And then practice, right? There's nothing like practice. pre-COVID, it was well known that information is consolidated during sleep. So whenever I do trainings, I always do 2 half days, not 1 8-hour day, and then let that sleep consolidate information, give them some homework so they're ready to go for the next morning. Again, setting up that anticipation. We're seeing some clients now who are doing 3 short days rather than 1 long day. So we look at remote meetings that are 8-hour meetings or 9 hours with a lunch break. Almost no immersion happens after the afternoon consistently. It's very, very hard, no matter how exciting that speaker is. Even this level of excitement that I'm giving you, it's very difficult to sustain immersion. It's just your butt hurts, you got to pee, whatever it is. So really keep repeating this practice. So practice makes perfect. And then lastly, something that Accenture's done and other clients is to audio or video record a coaching session. And that allows you as the coach to go back and audit this and see if it works. So I'm just going to give you an example of this. So this is a short video. I'm going to play this without sound. A video that was produced by Accenture, one of their learning architects and me, that they played at Davos a couple of years ago, talking about how they were accelerating learning. Again, I'm suppressing the sound so I can talk about it. But you can see that, this platform is showing second by second, how effective this video is at getting information into people's brains. So this is just me. Let's see, it looks like it's 10 people. So I sent around a bunch of people. I just said, hey, I want to get some data from you. So this is the aggregate of those 10 people. And if we go back and use this to curate that experience, the next time I were to do this, if this were coaching, I would want to go back and ask, okay, where do I, where does this thing lie? How do I actually create these immersion peaks and the most important information? How do I get rid of these low parts? So here I'm going to separate out and look at some actual individuals and just see how different people are responding. And you'll see that, brains work similarly. So, each of those individual, sorry about that, each of those individual touched the mouse and it moved it forward. So I'm just going to skip forward here. Apologies, you guys. Let's see if I can skip it forward. So I want to show you the individual ones. So here we go. So those brains work similarly. And that's what we expect. Brains work similarly. But look at this kind of teal colored curve. So that person is your immersion champion. He or she loves this video so much, is absorbing this information, is really into what's going on. And so that's the person that would be a great peer discussion leader. Really gives you an opportunity to kind of optimize how you're coaching. Or if it's a one-on-one, this person really loves it. So immersion is benchmarked to run from 0 to 10. It's linear, 6 is twice as good as a 3. And the norm for kind of video events is around 4. So 4 is right here, a little hard to see. This is 4. So anything that's above 4 is great. And so starts out really strong, kind of peters out a little bit, maybe could have been shorter, but allows you to really improve the coaching you're doing. So the last thing I'm going to do is to show you some real-time data. So to do that, I've got to share a different screen with you, and then we'll take some questions. So I think science is about, apologies for using a bad word, but science is about getting rid of bullshit. And so I'm a big believer in that, getting rid of the BS. And so I'm measuring my own immersion as we started. So I started a little early, so we probably started around here. And so whatever these peaks were, this is really when, the most compelling part of it for me was. And what's interesting about immersion is it happens between people. And so it gives us a chance to capture how that connection is happening so that you can create persuasion. So with that, I would love to get some questions. Jeff, do you want to shoot me some questions?
Yeah, that's a lot of information. Amazing, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We don't have a lot of time, but I have so many questions. Oh my God, we could keep you for an hour. But here's the deal. I think that some of what you're sharing is a little controversial for some folks, which is good because that's rich. But maybe we could jump right in with some questions that folks have about the distinction between the word persuasion and influence, and then maybe a little bit about coaching versus training. I had a number of questions because see, in a lot of the coach trainings that we are taught as coaches, the idea is to influence and to connect, but not necessarily to persuade someone. And so I think folks are interested to how you make those distinctions. And then secondly, along those same lines, I think we also think often of training as sharing content or downloading content into someone else so that they get to learn skills or capacities or competencies. Whereas coaching is really helping the other person feel safe to explore their own learning, like to find their own way as opposed to downloading stuff into them. And I know there's a mixture, the two things often intermingle, but a lot of folks are asking questions about your perspective on that, persuasion and training versus coaching.
Yeah, I'd say I'm not an expert on coaching, and so you guys are educating me on this, which I appreciate. And most of the work I've done has been the one-to-many, more of a training situation. So
Right.
I wouldn't make a strong distinction between influence and persuasion. I think all social creatures are involved in persuasion. I've been married 25 years. I still had to persuade my wife to be nice to me. And I persuade my kids to stay in school and whatever. So I don't make a strong distinction, but I understand that persuasion sounds very forceful, and maybe that's not the best approach with coaching. So if I've lacked subtlety, I apologize. I probably don't understand coaching well enough to be useful on that.
Well, I think it's an interesting distinction, like between, because I would say many of us are trying to support and influence our clients to change, right? So there's a way in which persuasion is there, but as a number of folks are bringing up in their questions, that also can sound a lot like selling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different. Coaches are not trying to sell their clients on something. So I'm curious, like, how does the brain or does the brain even distinguish?
I don't think we know, Jeff. I think it's a really good question, and I think it's worth exploring. Most of the work I've done has been in clinical settings with psychiatric patients, where you really do have to persuade because their brain is not working properly. And so I'm probably a little bit biased towards a little more heavy-handed, but I certainly want to get information in your head. I mean, ultimately, I can't brainwash you. I can't, none of this technology allows me to influence you in undue way. You have a big brain. You can decide what you're going to do. But at least I want to make the case as effectively as possible.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. And also understanding what's going on in the brain when you're finding that level of connection and creating psychological safety. I think another area of questions that are coming up for folks that they'd love to have you comment on is privacy. And whether or not this is always, or I guess this is my language, but I'm kind of picking out from a bunch of questions that this could be used for sort of nefarious purposes also. People that are really good storytellers also start cults. And I'm not accusing Tony Robbins. I'm just saying,
Possibly.
like, what's your sense of the data privacy issues around tracking the way people are reacting to things and then knowing when they need to be influenced differently? Where do you stand on all of that?
It's a huge issue, and as you know, Europe has much tighter controls than the U.S., and we do have clients in Europe, and we've gone through all that. So there's no in the one-to-many setting. Usually, it's just aggregated data. I'm seeing on average how well I'm doing. It really depends on the trust between, you mentioned trust earlier, between the employer and the client on whether you want to actually have that one-to-one setting where I know whose data it is. So I remember early on, Accenture showed me a big monitor they had, a picture of it, sent it to me. It said, hey, Tim, we're going to measure immersion during your training, and we brought wearables for you. If you want to participate, great. They said, look, we have really high trust within our employee base. The turnover is low. We really want to have people stay here for the whole careers. And they know we as trainers just want to get better. No one's getting fired. So I think data should not be pejorative, but I think the privacy issues are really important. It's got to be an opt-in for sure. I don't want to ever collect data without people knowing, and I think that's just wrong.
Yeah, it seems like there's a fine line between understanding your training impact and your influencing impact and your safety and the way you're creating connection, and then not moving into manipulation, like of using the data to manipulate a group to necessarily take in what you're trying to sell them.
And maybe the way to do that is to share it. So look, we're going to measure this, and then so again, you're going to get feedback. So I just stopped my data collection. So anyway, I'll get feedback and I'll know right away. And so look, we just want to get better, and then we can actually track that together as coach and trainee, and just see if we're actually making connection. And if not, then let's see if we have something different, or maybe a different coach is better for you, or whatever. So I just think it's we've got to be totally transparent about this for sure.
I think there's also one other thing you can comment on, because I know I've read articles that you've written on neuromanagement and trust, where you talked about the fact that this is sort of a counter theme scientifically, that human beings are also really good, the brain is really good at detecting bullshit.
Completely. Right.
So there's the other side of it, whereas somebody may be really good at telling a story to persuade and to influence and connect. But if they're making up the story and it's a lie, the human being, the brain, can you talk a little bit about that? Because you've written about that.
We have extensively done many studies in which, unconscious signals from the brain identify when people are lying. So we did a study recently which was published on corporate apologies. The CEO comes out and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we overcharged people." And on self-report, the first time you see that video, it's hard to know if they, really sincere or not. But neurologically, your brain knows. So if you hear that, that person 2 or 3 times tell you this BS story, then you're going to pick it up. So I think from the coaching perspective, you guys already know this, but yeah, no lying, no manipulation. I wish I was smart enough to be a cult leader. Maybe that could be my next. But I don't have that much energy in my life. So no cults. Let's not form any cults.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Maybe one last question that's a little bit more the science, since this is really your area. A couple of folks have been asking, how does oxytocin really work as the love hormone? So for example, one person asked, does an introvert have less oxytocin? Or how do we actually make sure in a positive way that we're doing stuff that releases oxytocin? Maybe you can talk briefly around how that actually works.
Wonderful question. So we have looked at the introvert, extrovert, no difference. We do find that people who are very warm, kind of people, release oxytocin for the same stimulus, than more so than people who are, like me, a little bit more nerdy and in their heads. And so what it means is that some people are going to be better at connecting than others. So those people tend to have more friends, for example. They also tend to be happier, which is really nice. The brain works on contrast. So it's not levels of oxytocin, it's really the release, and the amount of release is an index to the degree of connection. So I see my little kids that come give me a hug, I release a lot of oxytocin. Jeff, you're perfectly wonderful, and I'm sure if we met, I would release some oxytocin, but not as much as my kids, honestly. So I can kind of index that, and that's why I think having a measurement technology is useful. But great downstream effects. So we know that social connection is one of the key factors that reduce morbidity and mortality. And oxytocin actually reduces physiologic stress, which improves the immune system. So it's really, being a connector. And the big takeaway for me as a nerd is that this system is adaptive. So once I started doing this work, 20 years ago, I really began to focus myself on being more open, more warm, more vulnerable, and really connecting, investing in relationships around me. And I think I've been a lot happier and healthier because of it. So even if you're nerdy like me, you can get better and become more empathic and a better connector.
Well said. Yeah, no, in fact, I have been on that learning journey myself. And in fact, one of the reasons why I was frustrated with my editor when she chopped a lot of my references to your work out of my book was because it was such a powerful reference point for me to think about what I do when I'm with other people in social settings, and how do I potentially create warmth and connection, and how does that trust bond actually form, which is at the core of some of the work that you've done on trust. So I really appreciate that. And we have just zoomed through an hour, and I am literally and figuratively. And I'm just really honored that you took the time to share your expertise and your research with us here at the Institute of Coaching. Folks are asking in the chat whether or not they can get the slides, and I would say the video with the slides will be available on our website tomorrow, or within a couple days, so you should be able to follow up. Also, there were so many great questions. Oh my God, I was reading the questions thinking, I need another hour to be able to ask you these questions. So we will keep the Q&A and the chat box. We will send them We have all your emails for those of you that registered from all over the world. And it was so great to see folks from so many different places in the world joining us. And we will keep all that information and we will share it with Paul. And I would just encourage everyone to Google Paul and read some. His book is fabulous, but there's also some good articles if you want to just get a chunk. Like I know my first introduction to your work, Paul, was through Neuromanagement Journal that you wrote an article on trust. And it's really useful for us as coaches. So I highly encourage folks to get his book, Google, get the articles, and your website is, I think, immersion.com. Is that right?
Immersion.com,
Yeah,
right?
so we will stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure. And then one last thing, we will be having Paul live on LinkedIn on February 17th. And I get the privilege of interviewing him for a quick, but hopefully a very deep dive, 30 minutes. And I look forward to seeing you all there, 12 noon Eastern time. So thanks again, Paul, and thank you all for joining us. And until next time, stay safe.